Welcome, everyone. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony examining the global terrorism landscape. I thank our witnesses for appearing today. I now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. This is our first opportunity for this Congress to take a broader view of the terrorism landscape confronting the United States and the rest of the world. It's been 18 years after the attacks on 9/11, and we've seen some success with our counterterrorism policy. But we've also watched the universe enlarge with an unsettling number of terrorist groups and affiliates and offshoots. In an aggressive policy started under President Obama and continued under President Trump, we've successfully confronted the Islamic State in Iraq, Syria, to liberate the territory once occupied. However, we must remain vigilant. Simply because a group no longer controls territory does not mean ISIS has been defeated. ISIS fighters have scattered, but they are morphing into an insurgency in Iraq and Syria, where the group clearly feels emboldened enough that its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, just appeared on video for the first time in 5 years to reassert his authority in the wake of the lost territory. ISIS is also sowing the seeds of terror elsewhere by inspiring, guiding, and directing its affiliates and individual extremists throughout the world. Consider the Easter bombings in Sri Lanka. It killed over 250 people. ISIS has claimed credit for those attacks. Investigators believe that at least one of the suicide bombers had traveled to and trained in Raqqa, and others may have traveled to Turkey, Syria, or Iraq. ISIS clearly has an ability to export terrorism to parts of the world beyond the Middle East. We cannot let our success in liberating territory from this group blind us to the significant challenges that remain. Of course, ISIS is not the only terrorist group out there. Al-Qaeda remains a potent, if decentralized, force for spreading fear and violence. It is incredibly disturbing that ISIS and Al-Qaeda often compete against one another and against Iranian-backed terror organizations in many of the most fragile contexts worldwide. This interplay only fuels sectarian violence, radicalizes populations, and exacerbates intractable conflicts throughout the Middle East. No one excels at exploiting regional chaos quite like Iran. Iran's been on our list of state sponsors for terrorism for 35 years. And unfortunately, it has only expanded its support for terrorist organizations over that time. The Congressional Research Service lists the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, Houthi rebels in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq, underground groups in Bahrain, and of course Hezbollah and Hamas among the beneficiaries of Iran's terror patronage. Just earlier this month, President Trump designated Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization. I don't dispute the threats the IRGC poses, but I would note the designation may carry consequences in terms of retaliatory measures against the United States and U.S. personnel overseas. We must be clear-eyed about the threats to the United States and our interests. This includes recognizing a rise in white nationalist terrorism that threatens democracy and human rights at home and abroad. I agree with the congregants of the Chabad Synagogue in California, who suffered a tragic attack this weekend. We'll continue to seek justice for the victims of the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue, where my daughter was named. We cannot tolerate such acts of hate inside the United States or against our close allies like New Zealand, where a gunman's killing spree targeted the faithful visiting two mosques during Friday prayers just 6 weeks ago. Far-right plots against French President Emmanuel Macron and Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez highlight the terrorism is indeed diverse. We cannot be lulled into a false sense of security. We have to be prepared, strong and agile, counterterrorism strategy. The military has a role to play, but almost 2 decades after 9/11, it's clear the problem does not have a military-only solution. We need to address the underlying risks of terrorism, and we must ensure that our counterterrorism efforts account for the complicated politics in regions like the Middle East, Africa, South and Southeast Asia. This requires investing in foreign aid and diplomacy, not cutting the budget for them. I know there's a strong bipartisan support on this committee for smart policies that build on both military and non-military assets and holistic approach. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses with their views on the threats posed by terrorism today and what the U.S. can do better to defend our citizens and our interests worldwide. I now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Congressman Trump, for chairing this important hearing. Since September 11, 2001, our country has been engaged in a long and persistent war on terrorism. It is a generational battle against those that wish to threaten our way of life, our cherished liberties, and our freedoms. They target innocents simply because of who they are, what they believe, and the way they live their lives. The tragic attacks this past Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka that killed at least 253, including 4 Americans, was a stark reminder of terrorism's global reach and deadly consequences. 18 years ago, on that solemn Tuesday morning, when the beating heart of our nation was attacked by a group of al-Qaeda terrorists, we could not have possibly imagined the terrorist landscape today. Today, al-Qaeda affiliates stretch from the western edges of North Africa all the way to Southeast Asia. Sadly, none of us could even fathom the possibility that al-Qaeda's Iraqi branch could spin off and form a full-blown terrorist state the size of Great Britain across Syria and Iraq. The inhuman brutality inflicted by ISIS on the people of Syria and Iraq, including Muslims, Christians, Yazidis, and others, was a reminder for all of us. We fight this enduring battle against terrorism and the perverted ideology that inspires it to protect our families from this kind of evil. Unfortunately, ISIS no longer holds any territory, and its so-called caliphate has been delegated to the dustbin of history. The battle has been won, but the war continues. The ISIS threat remains. According to the National Counterterrorism Center, 14,000 ISIS fighters are still in Iraq and Syria. They remain armed and have continued to carry out attacks. ISIS' dangerous ideology remains a persistent and pernicious threat to the world peace, and hundreds of battle-tested foreign fighters heading home pose new challenges to authorities throughout the world. Notably, the conditions that led to the rise of ISIS in Iraq have not been completely changed, and the resurgence of ISIS 2.0 is a tragic likelihood. To complicate the landscape even further, Iran has earned the title of #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world by fostering a network of Shiite armed groups engaged in terrorism to achieve Tehran's designs. Their reach extends throughout the Middle East to countries like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Bahrain. But Iran's proxies are not limited to the Middle East. Its primary terrorist proxy, Hezbollah, is deeply entrenched in our own backyard in Latin America. If there's one thing the past 18 years have taught us, is that terrorism is a global threat. It's not just limited to one country or region. It is an international challenge that requires international responses. Terrorists thrive while we turn a blind eye, and they spawn and metastasize in ungoverned spaces till they are ready enough to reach our shores. Before 9/11, it was Afghanistan. Today, Syria's safe havens abound in areas of Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, the southern Philippines, and even Colombia. There is no doubt that the threat has multiplied. Wherever safe havens exist, American families are at risk. That's why American leadership is necessary now more than ever. We must work together with all of our friends and partners throughout the world to protect our values from those that seek to destroy them. We must not delude ourselves with dreams of quick strikes and missions accomplished. We must realize that to gain any measure of success, we will have to be in this for the long haul. We must not make the mistakes of the past and think that we can run away from problems abroad. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we will never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism. With that, Congressman Chone, I yield back and look forward to the hearing from our witnesses today.
I will now recognize members of the subcommittee for 1-minute opening statements, should they wish to make one.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Sherman, you're recognized.
A decade ago, I was in this room chairing the subcommittee that dealt with international terrorism. I suspect decades from now, they'll be in this room talking about international terrorism. That does not mean we've lost just because we cannot expunge international terrorism. As long as we're battling it and keeping it under control, our battles will not always be like World War II, where there's an actual surrender of our enemies. The administration has properly designated the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. Press reports indicate they'll soon designate the Muslim Brotherhood. That will raise some questions because there are so many organizations in the Muslim world influenced or inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood, including the governments of Turkey and Qatar. Venezuela's legal government is being thwarted by Maduro. Maduro's being aided by Iran. And finally, as to cryptocurrencies, these are the plastic guns of currency. That is to say, cryptocurrency can be used for some legitimate purpose, but its unique advantage is to help criminals, drug dealers, and terrorists. And Hamas has on their website how to make donations to Hamas using Bitcoin. It does America no good to see the dollar lose power and cryptocurrencies take their place and facilitate illegal transactions. I yield back.
Thank you. Now I recognize Mr. Shibet. 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as Mr. Sherman mentioned, been a long time, had the honor to be a long time serving member of this committee, and in fact, chaired this committee when the embassy attack in Benghazi took place. About a month prior to that, I had been with our Ambassador Stevens, for the better part of a day and a half in Tripoli. We've made some progress in fighting terrorism over the years, but as Mr. Sherman said, we're not there yet, and it's going to take a long, long battle. And despite ISIS's territorial defeat in our 18-year battle against al-Qaeda, both groups are still very dangerous. They have affiliates throughout the Middle East and Africa and Asia that threaten our allies and the security and stability of their respective regions. Iran also uses terrorism and terrorist proxies as weapons in its campaign to gain hegemony in the region, destabilize our allies, and ultimately, in their view, to try to destroy Israel, which is why the President was right in declaring the IRGC a terrorist organization. And finally, Sri Lanka. On Easter Sunday, the holiest day of the year for Christians, radical Islamists attacked 3 Catholic churches and other targets. The death toll staggering, hundreds murdered. Sunday masses were canceled this weekend, and barbaric attacks like this must never happen. And we mourn with all the families of those innocent souls who died celebrating Jesus' resurrection. And I yield back.
Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous material for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I will now introduce our witnesses. Mr. Ali Soufan is the Chief Executive Officer of the Soufan Group, as well as a member of the Homeland Security Advisory Council. He's a former FBI supervisory special agent who investigated and supervised several international terrorism cases, including the U.S. Embassy bombing in East Africa, the attack on the USS Cole, and events surrounding 9/11. At the FBI, Mr. Soufan served on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, FBI New York office, and received numerous awards and commendations for his counterterrorism work. Welcome. Ms. Vidya Ramalinga is the founder of Moonshot CVE, a company using technology to disrupt and counter violent extremism globally. She directs digital projects in over 25 countries and oversees partnerships with tech companies to respond to violent extremism on their platforms, online intervention programs to pull individuals out of violent movements, and automated messaging to disrupt closed extremist forums. She has a decade of experience engaging directly with extremists and previously served as a senior fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and a senior research fellow at the U.S. Institute for Public Policy. Welcome. Mr. Bill Roggio is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense Democracies and editor of the Foundation's Long War Journal, which provides original reporting and analysis of terrorism across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Previously, Mr. Roggio was embedded in the U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Army, and Iraqi forces in Iran, and with the Canadian Army in Afghanistan, and also served as a signalman and infantryman in the U.S. Army and the New Jersey National Guard. Thank you all for being here today. Let us remind the witnesses, limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the hearing record. Thank you so much for being here today. Mr. Soufan, please begin.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Trone, Ranking Member Wilson, distinguished members. As you will hear from my statement, I believe that the current geopolitical dynamics in the Middle East are fueling global terrorism and contributing to instability throughout the region and beyond. My statement will address 4 fundamental issues. First, we must recognize the resilience of the ideology fueling transnational terrorist groups and helping them recruit across the globe. Second, sectarianism has become the geopolitical currency of the Middle East, and terrorist organizations have become experts at exploiting this reality for their own gain. Third, the Arab Spring has shifted the calculus of terrorist groups, especially Al-Qaeda, which is playing the long game by focusing on co-opting local conflicts to help achieve its goals and objectives. Fourth, the war in Syria has exposed the true nature of the struggle underlying the current rise of militant groups and non-state actors. After the devastating attacks of 9/11, we responded swiftly. We have enjoyed numerous tactical victories since then. Yet, for all these successes, we have experienced a strategic failure of truly understanding why the ideology that organizations like Al-Qaeda spread across the world is so resilient. Even today, the caliphate may have been defeated in the physical sense, but the dynamics that allowed the so-called Islamic State to exist in the first place continue to endure. Sectarianism has long figured in the modern Middle East power struggles, but its importance has grown with Iraq's transition to a Shia-led government and other regional conflicts, especially in Syria and Yemen. Unfortunately, sectarianism has become a primary tool for competing states to solidify power and support. Principally, I'm speaking about the struggle for regional hegemony between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which has prolonged already bloody conflicts and led them a vicious sectarian edge. Although both Saudi Arabia and Iran heavily employ the tactic of sectarianism, their strategies are widely different in both execution and success. My written statement goes into great detail of these dynamics. The Arab Spring represented a key moment to the rise of militant groups and non-state actors. Even bin Laden, just before his demise, nearly 8 years to the day today, instructed his organization to move away from strictly targeting the West and to begin exploiting local power vacuums that followed the collapse of the various Arab regimes. With that, bin Laden was able to rewrite the global jihadi narrative from a regional perspective, a narrative that has local roots but global aspirations. This local strategy is now as much a part of the agenda of terrorist groups as are the acts of terrorism aimed to dismantle the world order led by the United States. Of all the Arab Spring revolutions, perhaps the most complicated is Syria. The war in Syria has exposed the true nature of the struggle underlying the current instability in the region. One glance at the Middle East suggests that the region has reverted to an intra-civilizational conflict. Sunnis fight Shia, Persians battle Arabs, Turks struggle with Kurds. The war in Syria also caused a refugee crisis without precedents, which, coupled with the rise of identity politics in Europe, gave oxygen to another transnational violent movement that is unfolding in front of our very eyes, radical right-wing terrorism. These two dangerous networks feed off each other. When a jihadi commits a terrorist attack, it benefits the right-wing terrorist. And when the right-wing terrorist commits an attack, it benefits the jihadi. It is my hope that I have managed to demonstrate that terrorism does not succeed or fail in a vacuum, and that the terrorist landscape of today operates at a larger strategic context. The resilience of the ideology, coupled with sectarianism and prolonged conflict across the Middle East due to geopolitical power rivalry, is what has given rise to what we are witnessing today. My written statement includes a numerous examples of the talking points I've highlighted here this afternoon, and I look forward for answering questions from the subcommittee. Thank you for the privilege and for the opportunity to be here with you today.
Thank you very much. Ms. Ramalingam.
Chairman Trone, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Vidya Ramalingam, and throughout my career, I have worked to understand and deter individuals from white nationalist extremism and terrorism. 10 years ago, I moved to Europe to undertake a mission to meet with white nationalist extremists in Scandinavia. When a white nationalist terrorist murdered 77 people in Norway, I led the European Union's first intergovernmental initiative on this form of violence. Today, I appear before this subcommittee as founder of Moonshot CVE. Our mission is to end violent extremism globally. We work regularly with the US State Department to disrupt and counter terrorist networks online. And my team and I have supported the Global Coalition Against Daesh, deployed programs to undermine Boko Haram recruitment in Nigeria, and have worked to prevent al-Qaeda affiliates from recruiting in Southeast Asia. We deliver programs to counter radicalization to white nationalist terrorism globally. White nationalist terrorism poses both a domestic and a global terror threat to the United States and its allies. It is dedicated to the overthrow of democratic governance and destruction of values intrinsic to the American way of life. It is an ideology based on the notion that the white race is threatened with extinction, the dehumanization of other races, and conspiracy theories that position particular ethnic and religious groups as enemies. Instances of this form of terrorism are increasing across the globe. Norway saw the deadliest of these attacks in recent history when a terrorist murdered 77 people in twin attacks on government buildings and on the island of Utøya in 2011. And in March this year, we saw attacks by a terrorist on 2 mosques left 50 people dead in Christchurch, New Zealand. These movements have encouraged a dangerous strategy of leaderless resistance, where individuals operate independently from one another and carry out violence to serve white nationalist extremist interests. This is not dissimilar from the tactics adopted by ISIS and affiliated groups, which have encouraged so-called lone wolves to independently carry out low-tech acts of terror across the globe. Mirroring ISIS, white nationalist terrorists have adopted the term white jihad and have increasingly chosen low-tech methods of violence, including vehicular attacks. White nationalist fighters and ideologues increasingly move across borders. The perpetrator of the New Zealand attack was an Australian citizen who traveled across borders to carry out his attack. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has drawn white nationalist foreign fighters from dozens of countries at an unprecedented scale. In the past several years, we've seen these terrorists themselves become dangerous international ideologues and hate preachers. Norwegian terrorist Anders Behring Breivik and New Zealand terrorist Brenton Tarrant published their own manifestos, which serve to inspire others to act. On Saturday, a synagogue in Poway, California, was attacked by a gunman. A manifesto suspected to have been posted by the gunman claims that he drew direct inspiration from the New Zealand attack. This once again highlights that the global white nationalist terrorist threat is directly inspiring violence here in the United States. Tarrant also pioneered a new communications tactic, live streaming a video of his massacre to the world using Facebook Live. This turned the attack into a powerful piece of digital propaganda itself, with millions of internet users watching globally. The internet did not create this global movement, but it has supercharged its evolution. Adopting increasingly decentralized structures, these movements may not be as deadly as ISIS, but they share with it many of its characteristics. My written testimony includes a range of strategic priorities to aid the fight against white nationalist terrorism, and I will mention just a few here. The fight against terrorism will be significantly enhanced by the designation of key individuals and groups whom we know to be behind acts of white nationalist terror as specially designated global terrorists. We encourage greater collaboration between governments and the private sector to move beyond simply content removal and deliver proactive strategic communications campaigns to counter the terrorist threat. We've partnered with Google to repurpose advertising technology to reach terrorists with content which discredits these ideologies and offers alternatives. This method has now been delivered globally, together with governments and the private sector, including actors such as the Gen Next Foundation here in the United States, in the fight against ISIS. Today, we are working to use this technology to change behavior of white nationalist terrorists online. We encourage this subcommittee to see white nationalist terrorism as part of the full spectrum of terror threats facing the United States and its allies. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this with you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roggio?
Chairman Throne, Ranking Member Wilson, esteemed members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the Foundation of Defense of Democracy, my apologies. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. The Easter Day suicide attacks in Sri Lanka were a stark reminder that this war is far from over. We face a brutal and uncaring enemy that is committed to its cause and believes it is justified in killing civilians in churches and hotels. The Sri Lankan attacks were claimed by a local group that swore allegiance to the Islamic State, and it coordinated the release of its propaganda with the Islamic State. Authorities are now beginning to unearth international ties between the two. In this war, we have been too quick to declare our enemies defeated. In late March, the Trump administration touted the Islamic State's loss of its last vestige of territory in Syria. The Islamic State may have gone to ground now, but it has by no means been defeated. The Islamic State has been down this path before. After the U.S. surge in Iraq, its predecessor, the Islamic State in Iraq, which was an al-Qaeda affiliate, regrouped and roared back to retake large areas of Iraq and Syria just 3 years later. This problem is by no means limited to the Trump administration. The Obama administration was quick to declare the defeat of al-Qaeda after killing Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Yet his deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was second in command on the day of 9/11, remains alive and directs multiple branches that operate active insurgencies across 3 continents. The jihadist threat has expanded since 9/11. Prior to 9/11, al-Qaeda operated openly in Afghanistan alongside the Taliban and had cells and small units scattered across several countries. Today, it manages full-fledged insurgencies in Yemen, Syria, Northeast and West Africa, and South Asia, including in Afghanistan, where it continues to fight alongside the Taliban. Some analysts seek to disconnect local jihadist insurgencies from international terrorist attacks, but this is a mistake. The local insurgencies and international terrorist attacks feed off of each other. The insurgencies give foreign fighters combat experience, training, network, and ideological reinforcement. International attacks provide propaganda and entice Westerners to conduct attacks at home or immigrate to wage jihad. At least one of the Sri Lankan suicide bombers is known to have traveled to Syria and likely provided key knowledge to execute those deadly attacks. Al-Qaeda used to have a monopoly on the jihad, but no more. The Islamic State, which rose out of a dispute between al-Qaeda's cadres in Iraq and Syria, is now in direct competition with al-Qaeda. These two groups share the same goal. They wish to reestablish a global caliphate and impose its harsh version of Sharia or Islamic law. Where they differ is how to achieve these goals. The Islamic State wants its caliphate now and ruthlessly attacks any who refuse to swear allegiance to its emir. Al-Qaeda's approach is far more patient and subtle. It is willing to work with local Islamist groups and believes the caliphate should only be declared when it can be properly defended. Iran, which alongside Pakistan are the biggest state sponsors of terrorism, also seeks to establish an Islamic State. It backs loyal militias in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. These militias are organized and trained along the same lines as Hezbollah. The long-term impact of these militias is still not fully understood, and they have a far greater recruiting base than Hezbollah had to recruit from inside Lebanon. While Iran primarily backs Shia groups, it has openly battled the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. It is not opposed to forming alliances with Sunni jihadists. Al-Qaeda maintains a network in Iran, and key leaders shelter there. This secret deal was documented by the U.S. Treasury Department in 2011 and several times since. Pakistan also continues to harbor numerous terrorist groups and uses them as a tool of its foreign policy. Its support for the Taliban has been unwavering and is leading us to defeat in Afghanistan. I would argue that we have already lost Afghanistan. We are merely attempting to negotiate the terms of our exit. Pakistan continues to sponsor terrorist groups that launch deadly attacks in India. It has paid no price for its perfidy. As our enemies have expanded their base of operations and remain committed to the fight, our will has faltered. We seek to disengage from the battlefronts, giving our enemies easy victories. This is a long war, and commitment is key. If we hope to end this threat, we must renew our commitment and present a united front. We must rethink our goals and strategy and recognize our enemies' goals and strategy. We have to figure out a way to effectively fight our enemies, both in the military sphere and the sphere of ideas. We must continue to combat state sponsors of terror and make hard decisions about countries such as Pakistan. We have to work with our allies to figure out what to do with the numerous detainees captured in Iraq and Syria. There are thousands of foreign fighters there and their families who are citizens of Western countries. Some remain unrepentant, yet we want to return home. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I will now move to member questions under the 5-minute rule. I will begin, followed by Ranking Member Wilson, and we will then alternate between the parties. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to discuss the interplay between technology and the terrorist threats. Terrorist groups like ISIS have been incredibly effective exploiting online resources to recruit, radicalize, spread messages and propaganda, plan attacks at various locations across the globe. Mr. Rumlingham, how is the use of technology for conduct of terrorist operations evolved in the last few years? And then also, what technology can we use, should we be using, to beat them at their own game?
Thank you, Chairman Trone. That's an incredibly important question. White nationalist extremists were early adopters of the internet. They were using online bulletins going back to the late 80s and the early 90s. But what we've seen is that changes and advancements to social media availability and technology has allowed them to recruit and radicalize at unprecedented rates. What we're seeing is that they're increasingly active not only on very mainstream, widely used platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, but also on more niche platforms like 8chan, 4chan, and even using encrypted platforms like WhatsApp and Telegram to coordinate amongst them. We've even seen the use of technology before and during attacks used to incite others to carry out acts of violence, and their content remains increasingly accessible. My company has been tracking the use of Google and Yahoo and Bing to access terrorist content over the last several years, and what we find is that individuals are consuming white nationalist extremist content in the West at rates that far exceed those that are consuming jihadist content on those platforms. Now, the use of technology can also be used against these groups. We need to see technology not just as a barrier to counterterrorism efforts, but we need to work through ways that we can develop new technology to automate the identification process of these individuals online, to directly interact with them online to offer them alternatives, and that's where using even publicly available technologies like advertising can be important, but also to directly intervene online to try and disrupt, start conversations with individuals and get them out of movements.
Mr. Zufan, it's clear that terrorist networks from across the ideological spectrum are adept at exploiting technology, but many of them use relatively low-tech methods to carry out their lethal attacks. Are we approaching this duality properly from a counterterrorism standpoint? And then how should the U.S. government balance its efforts to prevent these very different types of events given our constrained resources?
Thank you, sir. The jihadis use the same methods that we heard about that are used also by the white supremacists. However, I think one of the things that the jihadis are doing with communicating with each other is basically the networks that we heard about. Those guys know each other. Sometimes, as we've seen in Sri Lanka, somebody went there, probably trained, build a network over there. They come back and they conduct an attack. I think overall, our law enforcement and intelligence agencies are really doing a phenomenal job in countering this, because even when the threat went from radicalization, and sometimes individuals self-radicalize themselves online, to mobilization in a short period of time, we have so many operations where the FBI and other local and state authorities have been successful, especially through the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, in disrupting that. So I think the intelligence community and the counterterrorism agencies we have are doing a really good job in matching the threat, both from a low-tech and a high-tech level.
Ramalingam, I'm also on the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Europe, and we've been troubled by the rise of far-right nationalism movements in many European countries. They've had some electoral success lately and have succeeded winning seats in more than a few parliaments, including just last week, Spain. What's the likelihood of a government emerging in Europe that's heavily influenced by the far-right political movement with ties to white nationalist terrorisms, and what dangers could this pose to the U.S. and our allies?
So important to mention here that my organization, Moonshot CVE, works specifically on violent movements. So we do not actually work on movements that are operating in the political space. That said, these movements don't exist in a vacuum. They feed off of what they hear in mainstream media. They feed off of the current political situation. And there are worrying trends in Europe where we're seeing white nationalist extremist movements and terrorist organizations starting to form political movements. So we do need to be concerned about the way that develops.
Thank you. And I recognize Ranking Member Wilson for his witness questions.
Thank you, Congressman Trone, and thank each of you for being here today and raising such important issues. Mr. Roggio, you've been following terrorist groups for some time now with the Long War Journal. In your opinion, are the Iranian-backed groups operating in Iraq, such as AAH and the Badr organization terrorist groups, should the U.S. designate these groups as for their terrorist activity?
Yes, absolutely. I would argue most of these groups should be, some actually are. I believe Hezbollah brigades, and I believe AAH was just added to the list. No? Oh, okay. There have been two of them. Hezbollah brigades is one of them. A lot of these groups have sworn allegiance to Iran's supreme leader. They have said they would overthrow the Iraqi government if ordered to do so. They said they wish that its overall governing organization, the Popular Mobilization Front, they wanted to operate like the IRGC does inside of Iraq. And so these are a very direct threat to U.S. national security. They've also, members of these groups or leaders of these groups have said that they would attack U.S. interests in the Middle East if ordered to do so, including U.S. troops inside of Iraq. So they are a direct threat. I view these groups as just mini Hezbollahs that are ready to metastasize into a far greater problem than Hezbollah is today. And we all know what a great threat Hezbollah is in the Middle East right now.
And Ms. Ramalingam, with your social media background, with the social media platforms, a number of them have been successful in removing the ability of terrorist organizations to communicate with each other. What more can be done?
We would urge technology companies and the government to work together with private sector to move beyond simply takedowns. There's a huge amount we can do with content which, first of all, may not be illegal and may not be liable to be taken down, but also to find individuals who, if we remove their content, that person still exists and they may just repost it elsewhere or move on to another platform. What we suggest is the use of creative partnerships between both the public and the private sector to push strategic communications efforts which make use of available technology on many of these platforms to try and undermine the ideologies of these groups. These are efforts which have really taken place in the counter-ISIS effort, and we now need to mirror those efforts in the white nationalism space.
Well, your efforts are just so appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Mr. Soufan, with the recent defeat of the physical caliphate, how should the United States approach the ongoing counterterrorism operations in Iraq and Syria to prevent the success of counterinsurgency and terrorist sleeper cells by ISIS and its sympathizers?
First of all, sir, we cannot just say we won and we defeated them. ISIS probably doesn't exist physically, but ISIS still have the ability to inspire people around the world, as we've seen in the recent attacks in Sri Lanka, as we've seen yesterday in the videotape that was put out by Baghdadi, and that's the very first videotape, I think, in probably a decade. Or at least since his speech in Mosul. ISIS is going through exactly what Al-Qaeda went through after we swiftly kicked them out of Afghanistan in 2001, 2002. We thought Al-Qaeda is done, the Taliban regime collapsed, and suddenly they changed from being an organization to being a message. And that's what ISIS is trying to do today. They are trying to compete with Al-Qaeda in this local conflict that Al-Qaeda has been operating in all the way, as you mentioned, from the western shores of Africa to Southeast Asia.
And Mr. Rojo, earlier this month, the Trump administration designated Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, in its entirety as a foreign terrorist organization. How would you assess the significance of this designation, and what impact do you think it will have on the IRGC's ability to fund proxy groups?
Well, first, it should help limit the IRGC from operating internationally. Now that the individuals of the overall group are designated, they should have a much more difficult time traveling to places like Europe and South America, where they can do fundraising and conduct other activities. I think it was necessary. It's been a long time coming. The IRG's one of its sub-organizations, Quds Force, has been designated for some time. The IRGC acts as a terrorist organization. It sponsors the murder of American soldiers in the Middle East. And I think the impact of it, as far as safety, Iran is already our enemy. Iran has killed at least 603 American soldiers inside of Iraq during U.S. time there. So I'm not sure how this designation makes Iran even a greater threat to U.S. soldiers stationed in the Middle East.
And thank you all for being here today very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Congressman Allred of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. This is an important topic, and I'm glad that we're talking about it, and I'm hoping that we can handle it in a bipartisan, nonpartisan manner. Mr. Soufan, I wanted to begin with you because in your written testimony, you note that to truly eradicate the terrorist threat, we might need to understand the geopolitical context, and you talk a lot about sectarian conflict, and particularly the Saudi-Iranian divide and Cold War to a certain extent. Obviously, we have a limited influence on Iran. What can we do, though, the United States, with our leverage we have over Saudi Arabia, to influence that conflict or to mitigate it or to try and do what we can to steer away from the sectarian violence we're seeing?
Thank you. That's a very good question. And I think if you look what's happening in Yemen, what's happening in Syria, what we mentioned earlier, ISIS was defeated, or the original ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq, was defeated until the war in Syria and until sectarianism became a rallying call, and then ISIS found a livelihood again. One of the things that we can do is basically work with our allies in Saudi Arabia to stop the hate rhetoric that is being sponsored through radical Wahhabi madrasas across the Muslim world. The Saudis and some elements in Saudi Arabia use this Wahhabi radicalism across the Muslim world in order to limit Iranian influence in Muslim communities. But unfortunately, it's firing back on everyone, to include the Saudis themselves. So I think it starts with the theology, if you want to call it, or with that interpretation of the theology that is very foreign to so many places around the Muslim world. It was very foreign to Sri Lanka until in the last decade or so, when we start seeing all these madrasas popping up and people coming from the Gulf with coffers of money, building mosques and building madrasas and educating people on a version of Islam that did not exist before. We've seen it in Southeast Asia in the 90s that resulted in the Bali bombing and other bombings in Jakarta, and with what's happening in the Philippines with Abu Sayyaf and other groups. So it starts with the theology and with the ideology. And then when you're funding other groups to counter Iranians groups like Hezbollah, like Asa'ib al-Haq, like Harakat al-Nujaba, like Zainabiyun, like al-Fatimiyun, like al-Houthis, all these groups around the Middle East that the Iranians have been recruiting, funding, and training. When it comes to that, just let's be sure, our allies, that the money does not go to groups that's connected to Al-Qaeda. Yemen is a perfect example. They were giving a lot of aids to Abu al-Abbas Brigade, which is a Salafi group, and then the Humvees ended up with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, as we've all seen. We've seen that in Syria also, and we've seen that in Iraq, and we've seen that in so many different places. So I appreciate that, you know, they are trying to counter Iranian influence, but you cannot be a bull in a china shop while doing that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I agree with what you were saying. I see the Arab Spring, as you said, creating new challenges, but also perhaps new opportunities. And I'm interested if you could discuss a little bit what you have in your testimony about the Arab Spring and some of the new challenges that it's created for us, and where you think the United States can assist or be useful. Because to me, obviously the expansion of democracy is our goal. We want to see that, but then we've seen in Egypt and in other countries the way that went. And so what role can we play, and do you think that we should be looking to play it to influence that?
I think the Arab Spring created huge opportunities. First, for Osama bin Laden and for Al-Qaeda, because they looked into what's happening in the Middle East at the time. And Osama bin Laden wrote his, as we know from the documents recovered from his house, he wrote to his commanders and he said, everything I told you about just target the United States, forget about it, because we already defeated the United States. That's why people like Mubarak and Gaddafi and other dictators are falling in the Middle East. What we need to do is to actually move from phase 1 to phase 2. He means management of savagery, which is Al-Qaeda's plan, which we know about. Phase 1, you do terrorism in order to weaken the order, the states, the international order. Phase 2, you create a vacuum and you won't allow anyone else to fill that vacuum. Because whoever, as bin Laden told them before the Navy SEALs bullets took him down, whoever going to fill that vacuum is going to be the new agent for the Americans in the region. Phase 3, you establish the caliphate. So now what they did is you have Syria with their affiliates in Syria, then you have all the way what they are doing in Yemen, they have the Horn of Africa, they have a Sahel region, and imagine when their plan is to reconnect all these things together in a caliphate. That's what Al-Qaeda is doing, and they have been doing it under the radar because everybody has been focusing on ISIS. ISIS, exactly as my colleague said, they decided just because they hated the leadership of Al-Qaeda, personal conflicts that goes history when they were operating in Iraq, they decided to start the caliphate immediately, not going through the phases. So that is a huge opportunity for Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and we're seeing it giving fruits in places like Yemen, in places like Libya, in places like Mali, in places like Somalia, and so forth. Now, from our perspective, unfortunately, and that's something that I really wish we did not do, is we had this policy of leading from behind. And I think that policy made many different countries in the region feels that they can run the show. And we start seeing this competition between them, and everyone started to figure out their own sphere of influence in that area, trying to protect this sphere of influence in that area. Unfortunately, we did not allow democracy to take roots. For example, under the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, this is the only time since the time of the pharaohs that they actually had some kind of a democratic form. Remember the John Stewart of Egypt making fun of Morsi all the time. But immediately after, there's 2 or 3 months, and then there was an election in Egypt. They didn't allow this election to happen because then you will have civil society, and definitely the Muslim Brotherhood will lose in the ballot box. Unfortunately, we didn't support democracy. We did not support the movement that's happening across the Middle East, and we pay greatly for it today. That started with our engagement in Libya and Syria, and we continue to have the same strategy, unfortunately, around the Middle East, supporting dictatorships against the people.
Yep. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. And I recognize Mr. Mast of Florida.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you all for your testimony today. Ms. Ramalingam, I want to go back to something that Representative Wilson prompted, where you spoke about the need for some of those technology companies to crack down. Just as a quick follow-up on that, which technology companies are you speaking of specifically?
Thank you, sir. The technologies that I'm speaking about really, span Facebook, Google, and all of the main social media platforms that are used widely. Those platforms have taken action. It's important to note that since 2017, really, those platforms have taken action against white national extremism in different forms. What I would love to see from those technology companies is more efforts to move beyond simply takedowns and encourage partnerships with other private sector entities, organizations that are actively trying to undermine these groups independently, as well as governments, to form public-private partnerships to make this more sustainable and to make the fight against white nationalist extremism go beyond simply removing content. Because if you remove the content, the person who sits behind it does not disappear.
Thank you. I was just curious which companies you were talking about specifically. Mr. Soufan, thank you for being here. As we spoke a little bit before, I've read some of your work several times, enjoyed it. Want to talk a little bit about what you just spoke about Al-Qaeda stringing together different events and activities going on throughout the Middle East, and kind of juxtapose that to what's going on with Iran and Hezbollah. You could almost say, are they in competition for what they want to do throughout the region? And looking back on some of your history, right? The Cole bombing, the Khobar Towers, 9/11, Bali nightclub, things that you've played a role in. You were looking at Al-Qaeda before most people had heard the term or the name Al-Qaeda before. So I have a couple of questions in those veins. Number one, are there entities out there that are on your radar that we're not thinking about right now? That would be a question for you. And then as we think about the way things have changed since 9/11 in terms of human intelligence, geospatial intelligence, signal intelligence, cyber intelligence, certainly financial intelligence. I mean, that's been one of the big changes since 9/11. Does that change the way that we go out there and address this fight? When you look at the long-term approach that Iran and Hezbollah has to colonizing the Middle East versus those individual attacks that often prompt nation building for decades on end, because of this change in intelligence gathering, should there be a change in the way that we go out there and address our war on terror?
Thank you, sir. As when it comes to Iran, I think Iran's policy in the region is their strategy at least in the region is very sophisticated. And I think we won't do ourselves any favors if we underestimate that strategy and contain it only within the framework of terrorism. I think a lot of the groups that works for Iran today are groups that's not listed as terrorist organizations. They are involved in the political games in places like Iraq, in places like Lebanon. They are part of the government. They are
Specifically,
part of
while we're talking about it, we'd love to hear the names. I'm sure everybody would love to hear names.
Like, for example, if you want to look into Iraq, you will have places like we mentioned the Better Organization, Asa'ib al-Haq, Harakat al-Nujaba, all groups that work under Qasem Soleimani, under Al-Quds Force, but some of them have even members of the Iraqi parliament, and Iraq is considered an ally country for us. So they are engaging on many different levels. They have groups that we correctly declared as terrorist organizations. So they are engaged in trying to get all these militants that they have been working with them in Iraq and other places and trying to make them more political, and they are progressively succeeding in doing so. So this is a very dangerous area. A lot of these other groups that Iran work with and we did not declare, we need to focus on these organizations, because these organizations, in case of any kind of conflict, rest assured, they will do whatever Al-Quds Force and Qasem Soleimani want them to do. So this is something that we haven't been focusing on, and I think we need to focus on it, and we need to look at it within the bigger geopolitical conflict context that's happening. So Iran's involvement is happening on many different levels. Security and terrorism is only one of it. They have a lot of other things that they are doing in their own form of nation building. They kind of became experts in creating a formula that actually co-opt the government from inside, with building relationships between militants, between the government, and between elements in the army. And we've seen that in Yemen with what happened with Ali Abdullah Saleh and al-Houthis. We've seen that in Lebanon with Hezbollah, and we've seen that also in Iraq with al-Hashd al-Shabi and the Iraqi army and the Iraqi government. So that's something that we definitely need to keep in mind in order to basically have a forecast of our relationship in the region overall. As for the other terrorist groups that I've been focusing on, I think all the affiliates of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, I believe, strategically is still way more dangerous than ISIS. And what I think that we might see, I think we might see members of ISIS rejoining their mother organization if al-Baghdadi is not in the picture. We might see new leadership appearing in the Salafi jihadi movement that might have the ability to reunify the Salafi jihadi movement, especially Hamza bin Laden, bin Laden's son, who did not criticize ISIS a lot, at all, actually. Ayman Zawahiri criticizes ISIS. Hamza only talk about that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are all followers of his dad. I think this is something that we have to worry about, and I believe that State Department have been paying attention to this, because they recently, just like about a month or so ago, declared Hamza bin Laden as, they put on an award for his capture or any information about him. So I think we might start seeing this kind of unification between entities of ISIS and between the mother organization Al-Qaeda. Just 2-3 weeks ago, Al-Qaeda in Yemen started putting videotapes of members of ISIS who came and joined Al-Qaeda again, and they were making fun of ISIS and the caliphate, and the fact that it's, that the title is expanding and remaining, which is obviously it's not expanding nor remaining in their point of view. So a lot of these things, we need to figure out the threat, not as it is today, but how it might be tomorrow, and what are the entities on the Shia side and the Sunni side that might create a problem for us and for our national security interests in the region tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Soufan.
Thank you.
Thanks. I thank the gentleman from Florida. My apologies for my late arrival. I recognize Mr. Malinowski for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Soufan, I wanted to ask you to discuss some of the similarities between the jihadi Salafi groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the new threat or growing threat of white extremist terrorist groups. I mean, superficially, they're different. One claims to fight for a twisted form of Islam, the other attacks mosques. But would it be fair to say, would you agree that, in fact, in their worldview, in their prejudices, and their desire to create ethnically pure states, and some of their conspiracy theories, they're actually quite similar?
Absolutely. There are glaring similarities between them. As you mentioned, sir, the whole issue about declaring or fighting for pure states or pure societies, also taking advantage of the social and the cultural and the political divisions in the societies in order to make themselves more relevant and more mainstream. In the same time, their use of social media. Now we start seeing also transnational connections and manifestos that's being written by everyone who commits a terrorist attack on the right-wing side or the white supremacist side, which is very similar to the martyrdom video or the martyrdom statement from the jihadi side. We also, I think, we start seeing that transnational network. There's a travel pattern that is reminding me very much so with the travel pattern that we've seen early on, at least in the late 80s and early 90s, with the jihadi movement, when they used to go to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan or the communist regime in Afghanistan. And now we see a similar kind of travel pattern in going to Ukraine. Lots of them are going to East Ukraine, but also some of them are going to West Ukraine. So there's a lot of overlapping similarities.
So it's transnational, and yet it's correct to say that we are not sharing intelligence with our allies about the white supremacist groups in the way that we are or have consistently shared intelligence on ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, I think we're very limited in what we can do because we don't have them declared as terrorist organizations, and this makes it very complicated. I mean, we can. I don't think legally we can have the authority. I don't think the intelligence agency, let's put it this way,
Well, the
have the
FBI,
authorities.
would the FBI have the authority to share with its counterparts?
I think if there is criminal cases that's related and connected to other criminal cases that's happening in allies countries, maybe there is an opportunity, but I don't think we do it on the I know we don't do it on the same level that we do it with the Salafi jihadis and with the other type of Islamic terrorism.
Understood. Well, the threat is obviously growing by any measure. The number of attacks of all kinds by the white extremist groups has been increasing. Just one statistic, there was about a 60% increase in anti-Semitic attacks in the United States just between 2016 and 2017. Is this because suddenly in 1 year there were 60% more anti-Semites in the United States, or is there something in the atmosphere which is emboldening these people? And I maybe pose this question to you, Mrs. Ramalingam.
Thank you. Yes, we have seen evidence that the threat is growing, not just here in the United States, but globally. Now, there's a number of factors which will play into that, one of which is reporting is actually increasing, reporting of these sorts of incidences, which will play into that growth. But even when it comes to terrorism attacks, beyond just simply hate crime perpetrated by individuals connected to these movements, we see on a global scale, the Global Terrorism Index has cited that in the 13 years prior to 2014, there were 20 attacks that took place. In the 3 years prior to 2017, there were 61 attacks that took place. So that's not just about increased reporting. That's about increased capacity of violence from these groups. Now, the nature of these movements has changed over the past several decades. They've taken an increasingly decentralized approach to organizing. It's no longer simply about fixed terrorist organizations or terrorist cells that are developing. We're really looking at loosely affiliated networks of individuals who choose to carry out acts of violence independently. That poses greater challenges both for law enforcement and intelligence agencies to actually identify and disrupt those individuals before they carry out their attack, and that's playing into that trend.
Isn't it also a factor that in the past, virtually every authoritative voice in our society would have been telling these people that they're alone in their delusions, but now some of their ideas are being echoed by politicians, by leaders in our society. The idea of a deep state that is conspiring against the people, the idea of immigrants invading us from every single side. I mean, they're hearing things from high up that reflect some of their own delusions and conspiracy theories. Do you think that that's a factor?
Well, what I would say is that, as I mentioned, these movements don't operate in a vacuum. The words and actions of political leaders do matter. What the U.S. can do right now to indicate that it is taking a stance against white nationalist terrorism is add white nationalist terrorist perpetrators to the list of specially designated global terrorists. That will indicate not only to potential perpetrators, but also to wider communities that this issue is being taken as seriously as it should be.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Again, my apologies. I just want to start by saying I just got back from a trip with Chairman Albio Sires to Colombia, where we had a meeting with good meeting with President Duque. Went to Cucuta and saw the humanitarian crisis at the border and the suffering of the Venezuelan people wrought by the Maduro regime. We talk to families who travel hours with their children to give them one meal, to be able to give them one meal per day. And we saw the humanitarian resources from the United States, from the UN, from other nations around the world that are sitting in warehouses across a bridge that has been blocked by Banduro because he has chosen to prevent the suffering that he has wrought from being alleviated in his country, and by not allowing those resources to be delivered. As we walked across the other bridge in Cucuta, Venezuelans were coming and going throughout the day to try to get a meal, and they shouted out to us, pleading for the support of the United States. So I only mention that as we watch closely what happens in Venezuela now as the Venezuelan people try to restore democracy in their country. As we told President Duque, we offer support to the Colombians, the Lima Group, and nations around the world as interim President Guaido works to restore democracy in the nation of Venezuela. I want to turn back to this hearing and the purpose of your being here. It's been 18 years since almost 18 years since the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and the focus of U.S. foreign policy is shifting toward greater power competition, but the transition occurs as the U.S. still faces these threats from a disparate array of jihadist, Iranian-sponsored, and white nationalist terror groups. The recent defeat of ISIS's territorial caliphate is a noteworthy milestone, but the ideology, as you've spoken about throughout this hearing, remains active around the world. It's demonstrated by two events that occurred yesterday. First, the revelations that one of the suicide bombers in the horrific Easter attacks in Sri Lanka trained with ISIS in Syria, and that as many as 4 of the terrorists involved in the attacks may have traveled to Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, where they have, it's believed, they have contacted ISIS operatives. Second, ISIS released a video showing Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The video is his first appearance in nearly 5 years as he urged his followers to fight on despite the recent losses by the group. And both events demonstrate that while ISIS's physical caliphate is destroyed, they continue to have a network of supporters around the world who are trained by ISIS operatives and loyal to the organization's cause. Most importantly, these individuals seek to launch attacks against individual innocent civilians. Furthermore, the challenge of Iranian-backed groups persists, threatening U.S. interests and military personnel, as well as our allies and partners in the Middle East and around the world. The transnational threat posed by white nationalist terrorism is clearly growing, as exemplified by the horrific attacks in Christchurch, at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and just days ago at the Chabad of Poway, just north of San Diego. Understanding these motivations and threats will inform future subcommittee hearings and help members consider legislation to improve our U.S. counterterrorism policy. And a greater comprehension of these threats will help fulfill our duty to help keep the American people safe. That's the reason that we held this hearing. And my greatest regret in being late is that the reports I've gotten from all of my colleagues is that all of our witnesses have been terrific, and we're grateful to you. I just had 2 questions. Ms. Ramalingam, in your written testimony, you claim that development of new technology is required to help process and analyze data to better understand and keep pace with the evolving tactics of white nationalist extremist individuals and groups online. Given Mr. Sufan's acknowledgement in his exchange with Mr. Malinowski about the shortfall in cooperation among nations of the world in addressing the white nationalist threat, what type of technology would support these efforts? Would this technology help assist nations to cooperate with one another to combat it? And what can Congress do to help catalyze those efforts?
Thank you, Chairman. We absolutely do need new technology to fight this particular threat, as these movements are moving to decentralize networks of individuals on the dark corners of the internet. We need technology which can automate the identification process, automate geolocation processes, automate risk assessments of those individuals on the basis of the digital footprint that they are leaving us, indicating that they're getting involved. What my company has done over the past few years is we've invested heavily in the development of this sort of technology. It relies on us building databases of risk indicators well into the millions of texts that's being shared by these groups, phraseology that they use, propaganda that they share, memes, photos, everything we can use online to identify them. So what we need to do is facilitate more public-private partnerships to advance this technology, bring in the tech community so that we're taking advantage of advancements in artificial intelligence technology to bring this into the fight. And what I would also suggest is that we move not only towards removal of that content, but looking at how we can take advantage advantage of just how brazen these groups are in the online space to try and find them before they perpetrate attacks.
Right, just give me an example of that.
So an example is Brenton Tarrant, in the moments before he carried out his attack, including 2 days before his attack, had started posting not only on Twitter, including images of his weapons with, basically referring to as heroes of terrorists across the world who had previously carried out similar attacks. He posted that on Twitter. In the moments before his attack, he was posting on 8chan that he was intending to carry out his attack. There were a slew of posts which followed from individuals around the world supporting him, encouraging him, and congratulating him on carrying out those acts of violence. And then in the weeks that followed, my organization has tracked individuals across the globe that have sought to consume propaganda that came directly from Brenton Tarrant, as well as his affiliates across the globe. Technology can help us to find those individuals and to interact with them.
Well, what happens with that information now? What happens when someone tweets something like that? What happens when they make those postings on 8chan?
Well, technology companies are getting better at identifying this content, but they're not there yet. And the greatest example of that was just how efficiently Brenton Tarrant was able to live stream his attack, the entire massacre. Facebook took down millions of copies of that video in the 24 hours that followed the attack, but we're still not there, obviously, to fully identify that content quickly. But there's movements to make this happen. We just need more of it.
And just one last point on this. So for all of the people who have posted their support of what he had done, you're suggesting that using advanced technology to identify not just someone who praises the horrific terror act that he carried out, but likely there are other indicators too that should be that are out there and that could readily be gathered using technology.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of this work needs to take place in the preventative space. This is the pre-criminal space before somebody actually carries out an attack. But if they're indicating affiliation or glorification of the violence, we can automate the identification process for that individual and try and interact with them to try and get them out.
All right. Thanks. And Mr. Wilson, if I may ask one more. Thanks. Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Soufan, in 2008, Britain designated Hezbollah's military wing as a terror organization, which diverged from the official position of the EU. It wasn't until mid-July of 2013, so 5 years later, that the EU adopted a similar position, and only following claims of the link between Hezbollah and the Burgas, Bulgaria bus attack. The British government recently announced the blacklisting of Hezbollah's political wing, thereby designating the entire organization in its entirety as a terrorist organization, thereby essentially treating a terrorist organization as a terrorist organization. What impact will this have on Hezbollah, and how effective will their designation be if the EU does not follow suit? And then I'll also just put out there now for you to add, when you're finished, go ahead and comment on the response that people point to the government of Lebanon and say we can't do it because of Hezbollah's position in that government.
Well, this is what the EU and this is what the British claimed for a long period of time,
Right.
because Hezbollah is member of the parliament, member of the government, and they are engaging with Lebanon on a government level. And there's UN troops on, some of them are Europeans on the border. And if you start dealing with all the entities of Hezbollah as terrorist organization, then it creates legal complications for them to deal. This is their excuse. But Hezbollah is Hezbollah, and the political leadership in Hezbollah and the military leadership in Hezbollah both fall under the leaders of Hezbollah, the Hassan Nasrallah, who is the leader of Hezbollah. So I think this is one of the things that we've seen the UK finally recognizing, as you mentioned, a terrorist organization as a terrorist organization. But I think it will be probably more complicated for the EU to do that because of actually what you correctly mentioned, their engagement with the government of Lebanon. I think eventually it needs to be done, because if you consider that organization as a terrorist organization, you cannot consider the people who are defending and speaking politically for the organization to be individuals who are not connected to a terrorist organization. I think the logic doesn't flow here with this.
Well, and just finally, the argument that there's a legal complication that may exist when you do that, is there a strict line between the two separate entities legally that prevents anyone who's in the what the EU would refer to as the humanitarian wing, the political wing of Hezbollah, and the terrorist wing? Is there what's the legal distinction there? As they worry about legal complications, what are the legal distinctions between the two?
Absolutely not. We don't know of any distinctions between both. Hezbollah is an organization that's very popular among big segments of the Lebanese society. That's why they are voted into the parliament. And I think in order for some countries in the West to deal with that situation, they figured out, okay, there is a big difference between the political element and the military element. But I think both of them are under the leadership of the same individual, both of them under the leadership of the same, command, politically and militarily. And when there's elections in Lebanon, the person who put out the agenda of Hezbollah and put out who are the candidates of Hezbollah is actually the head of the military of Hezbollah also, who is Hassan Nasrallah, the head of both the military and so there's no difference. This is some lawyers coming up with a way how to deal with an organization when it's listed as a terrorist organization. And we came up, earlier today, I think, with Congressman Mass, we're talking about different groups that us in the United States, we have a problem with that. We did not declare them as terrorist organizations in Iraq, even though we know that they operate under Al-Quds Force. And we know that they are involved in the war in Syria, and we know that they are trained and work closely with Hezbollah. And we did not declare them as terrorist organizations because that they have people in the parliament in Iraq, because they are part of the political process in Iraq too.
What would the designation mean if the EU followed suit and acknowledged that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization? What would that mean for Hezbollah financing? What would that mean for Hezbollah terror operations?
Honestly, I don't know if Hezbollah have money in the EU or have money in Europe. They get all their money from Iran and from different operations and criminal activities in Latin America and other places. But I think one of the things that it can limit the travel of so many members and leaders of Hezbollah who are actually traveling sometimes to Europe as part of the Lebanese government or a part of being members of the Lebanese parliament. It will limit the engagement between European political leaders and between Hezbollah. For example, many of the negotiations for hostages, between Israel and between Hezbollah went through Germany. Because the Germans were involved in negotiating with the group because they did not consider it as a terrorist organization at the time. So it will definitely impact them, and it might impact their fundraising capabilities in Europe. But I'm not familiar that they are doing it publicly. They are probably doing it covertly.
Okay, I appreciate it. Again, my apologies for my delay, but I'm most grateful for the three of you and Mr. Wilson, my ranking member. Thanks to the witnesses and to all of our members who have been here throughout the day. Thank you for your excellent testimony. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions, so we would just ask that the witnesses respond to their questions in writing. My request to our colleagues is that any witness questions for the hearing be submitted to the subcommittee clerk within 5 business days. And without objection, this subcommittee hearing is adjourned. Thank you.